Hello everyone, can you hear me? Test, test, test. Can anyone hear me on the stream right now? Yes. Bismarck, can you say something?
Hallo, Test, 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 1, 2, 3, ich bin Deutsch.
Can you hear Bismarck too? Excellent. So then, should we? I mean, there's watching right now 0, but that's not true, I think. So I think, yeah, today's stream is basically about the Battle of Britain, and what we want to discuss is basically how, if at all, the Germans could have won the Battle of Britain without changing any major stuff like doctrine beforehand or production of different planes, because I stumbled about certain aspects where I realized, oh, they could have changed that or they could have known better. And also from Bismarck's side, mainly on the tactical and operational level, what they could have done differently. This is, of
Jawohl.
course, a bit from hindsight, but also, yeah, quite to see if it was possible at all.
Exactly. It's a tough question, and I hope that we can make some headway with it. It's not going to be an easy topic, of course. There's a lot of things that were said and written about the Battle of Britain, and both of us, we've been pretty much going through all the information that we could find. And I mean, you already made quite a big series on the Battle of Britain on your channel, and over the last couple of days, I've been slugging through a couple of books as well. So it's gonna be good. It's gonna be good indeed.
Excellent. Then let's begin with that part that I read, which actually triggered this question again, because in the Battle of France, the Germans attacked near Paris several industrial areas and also a harbor with around 600 bombers and 500 fighters. And they realized that the damage was not enough. Now, a main problem for both the British and the German in 1940 was that both dropped bombs on each other, but they did almost no damage, but they didn't knew it. Basically, Overy stated in Battle of Britain that both sides assumed, because they couldn't detect enough damage and a pattern in it, that both were conducting terror bombing, although both sides actually intended to hit only military targets. So the difference between the British and the German is the Germans won the Battle of France, and so they had access to nearly all those areas that they previously bombed. So they could have performed proper studies and see, okay, the amount of bombs we have is not enough. The amount of planes we use is not enough. The accuracy is not good enough. We need to change that. But the thing is, I never read that they did something like that. I mean, here it's stated that they basically refer to report, but it doesn't seem they adapted this doctrine or something for the Battle of Britain. Or do you know anything about that, Bismarck, that they changed after the Battle of France how they would conduct strategic bombing?
Well, they didn't really change that much. The problem with the Battle of France is, of course, that the Germans won. So the Germans, in a way, decided amongst themselves, and they were, of course, people that didn't agree with that notion. But as a winning nation, you always think that what you did was correct, because obviously you won. And with the Luftwaffe, which was a very tactically orientated air force, was designed to help the ground units. Obviously, the Stuka is probably the best example of that. But even the bombers that they had, the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17 at that point, and then later on the Junkers 88s, which obviously come in, a lot of them were designed to be used in the tactical sphere. And when they did attack industry, which they, as you said correctly, in France, they did do that, they didn't really, like you said, afterwards go about and check, okay, what actual damage did we inflict? Because, well, we won, obviously we did something right. and the damage that we did inflict, considering how fast the campaign actually went, must have been good enough. And when you have that kind of winning sensation behind you, and at the same time you don't really go and check what actual damage you did because you consider it to have been good enough for the duration of the campaign, then you obviously land into a line of thought that makes you undervalue or depreciate essentially the problems that you might have had in a longer campaign.
Okay, now let's assume the Germans didn't make that error and they went thoroughly in and looked at the damage which was done in France, and they concluded, okay, it's not enough, and if we attack industry or ports, we need to change something.
Well, the
Would
thing
they
here
have
is
been able to do it?
yes and no. The thing is that when the Luftwaffe launched itself into the Battle of Britain, and when they started bombing, especially later on when they started bombing London and so on, they were essentially the first air force that would launch bomber formations that would drop, for example, more than 1,000 tons in a day on a city. And that in itself at that point was unheard of. So for them, kind of catching these, I will call them milestones, even that's a bad word here, but having these milestones of more tonnage, and more tonnage, they couldn't really probably appreciate or understand how little they, in the grand scheme of things, were actually dropping. Because if you look at the total bombs dropped on Britain during the Battle of Britain, and then you look at the bombs dropped on Germany afterwards in 44 and 45, it's a completely different picture. Those two values don't even it's a completely off the scale what happened afterwards. So, but all of this is an escalation that is going on. And for the Germans, having hit those milestones early on and saying, okay, so we managed to make this bombing raid on this factory with 300 tons. Then we did this raid on this port with 400 tons. Nobody has done this before. We are doing something right. And while they certainly could have, and some of them did, in fact, call for more strategic bombing and say, like, we have to get a strategic bomber out there and have a bomber that can really drop enough ordnance that really it makes a difference. Those voices weren't enough. And even though in the industry there wasn't a huge drive to do that. So in a way, the Germans were fooling themselves into thinking that they were doing the right thing because they were hitting those milestones early on, even though most of their bombers that would actually fly to Britain didn't even have their full bomb load because the range was just too far. So yeah.
So, but to a certain degree, could have they derived this information too that it was simply not enough?
Oh, I think certainly some of them also realized it during the Battle of Britain that they were not inflicting enough damage. The problem is that the Germans switched tactics maybe 3 or 4 times during the Battle of Britain. And every single time they did it just at a crucial stage. So in a way, you might as well argue that they had enough to end the Battle of Britain in their favor, but they never really did it because they misunderstood the way the wind was blowing, essentially.
Now, there's another point in why the Luftwaffe failed, or the defeat of the Luftwaffe from James Coram. He actually notes that the Battle of Britain should have been fought not above the airfields, but against the shipping and the ports of England, because this was the major bottleneck of Great Britain. If they cut off the supplies, and especially in combination with the submarine force, this could have happened. And his basically proposal is that the Germans had developed an airdrop magnetic mine, which was hard to detect. And if they build up enough of them and then drop them near all the ports and all major shipping lanes, that this to a certain degree could have blockaded Britain.
Well, for the Luftwaffe, that would have been hard. Because if you look at the geographical location of Britain, even with Luftwaffe 3, Luftwaffe 5, Air Fleet 5 in Norway, stationed in Norway, it would be extremely hard to mine all the inlets for the British shipping to come in. In the Channel, no problem. On the east coast of Britain, not that bad. Near Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, or the east side, that's going to be really, really hard for the Germans to do. Even if they use U-boats, even if they somehow get a ship in there to mine those inlets, it would have been extremely hard. What should be said, however, is that the first phase of the Battle of Britain, which essentially started more or less after the capitulation of France, when the Luftwaffe was not yet given direct orders from the Oberkommando as to what they have to do. They all knew that Operation Sea Lion, the invasion, right, was something that everybody was talking and thinking about, but they never received a clear command of what they were supposed to do until later on. So in July to pretty much the first week of August, what the Luftwaffe was doing was concentrating on the shipping, especially the shipping in the Channel. And they did, in fact, succeed in sinking quite a number of ships, damaging quite a number of vessels as well, and also forcing some Royal Navy destroyers and ships up onto the west coast and east coast, where they're out of range of the Luftwaffe planes. Now, obviously, at this point, the Germans are using the Stukas. This is probably the only time the Stuka was of any value during the Battle of Britain, and they're using some fighter bombers as well. But overall, the Kanalkampf, as it's known, does inflict a lot of damage on the sovereign side of Britain, but it's not really enough to create this kind of stranglehold, especially because the U-boats in the Atlantic are still letting ships trickle through.
So basically the south side of England was more or less to a certain degree blockaded. The thing is, you don't need to blockade all harbors, because once you create the bottleneck, at certain harbors they don't have the capacity anymore.
True.
And another stuff is, which is probably unknown to most people nowadays, or it's not so obvious because I read it up, and it's basically, back then you basically had to load out all your ships manually. So you needed a lot of labor and you need to transport it. So if the question is, I mean, you probably don't have information on the capacity of all the different ports in England or Great Britain.
The thing is that that's such a campaign, even though, as you quite rightly state, that it creates a bottleneck where only certain ports are able to really fill the need that the merchant navy has for when it comes to unloading, loading the ships, and just deep sea harbor and so on. You still are talking about a campaign which would have to account for the German Navy as well. It would have to be done in accordance with the Navy. And if we see one thing during the Battle of Britain, especially early on, that the cooperation between the German armed branches is not very good. The Luftwaffe is essentially set to do its own thing until later on. There is no army liaison or Luftwaffe liaison in the army for Operation Sea Lion until like a week before it was essentially called off. And with the Navy, I'm not quite sure how things were turning out in that regard between the cooperation between the Luftwaffe and the Navy at that point. But as far as I know, the cooperation between those branches only started really after the Battle of Britain, where the Germans then also sent out planes into the Atlantic to search for convoys and ships that were on their own.
So basically, we also had to account for that they immediately get rid of the inter-service rivalry and basically get their shit together.
Yeah, and in many ways they didn't.
Yeah, this is also, I mean, Coram states quite clearly that he notes the major successes of the Focke-Wulf 200 and notes there were just a handful of this plane, and they conducted a lot of they achieved a lot of damage. So one can imagine how much with specialized planes could have been reached, because in 1942 he notes that a few squadrons of Heinkel 111 were used and they were also quite successful. But in 1940 there was not much there. The fun thing is, I'm not entirely sure. The Fliegerkorps 10 was the one especially conducting anti-shipping operations, right?
Yeah, so you had on the German order of battle, essentially, you had three air fleets. So you had Luftwaffe 5, Air Fleet 5, that was stationed in Norway. They didn't really do anything until a little bit later on. And then you had Luftwaffe 2 and Luftwaffe 3. And those were the ones that were really primarily engaged. And then in those, you obviously had Fliegerkorps, which is just one branch down, essentially. And I think, yeah, Fliegerkorps 10 was one of the crucial ones there.
Because I think I read it up in Weserübung that it launched major operations. Yeah, and it is also stationed.
Yeah,
it is
I think
stationed in Norway. I see here right
yeah,
now.
that there was Fliegerkorps 2 was doing most of the stuff near Dover,
Yeah.
and then between Dover and Calais. And then you had Fliegerkorps, I think it was 8, who was doing mainly the channel. And then you had Fliegerkorps 10, I think that was doing most of the stuff inland, but I'd have to check on that.
Yeah. So, and I've watched the chat for a bit. Yeah, we will talk about radar soon. And also, sorry, there's no donate button because Super Chat is not supported if the streamer is in Austria. So
maybe we'll do it next time. We'll do it on my channel. And
so probably we'll switch the channel, or I think I added a donate button on my about page yesterday, but I hadn't time to put it up here.
you can put it in the description as well.
Yeah,
This,
I hadn't time. I wanted to do it, but I forgot. So
okay.
So sorry for not doing this. So I mean, the question is, theoretically, it would have been possible to get a better stranglehold if there was the inter-service rivalry was not there, and they also would have focused mainly on the shipping. How did the British react to the attacks on the shipping in the Channel? Did they stop the inflow of ships? Did they assign the fighter command or something? What was the reaction?
Well, in the beginning, they had two problems. First, they didn't really have enough fighter pilots and planes to adequately cover the channel. This was probably their main issue in the beginning of the Battle of Britain. But from what they had, they did relatively well. But you still see German bombers and dive bombers inflicting quite severe damage on quite a few of the port cities there, and sinking any number of ships. So you can see that also definitely with the Royal Navy pulling ships back to the east or the west coast of Britain. You can see the impact there, because if the ports would be adequately defended, if there would be enough firepower and enough air cover, then they wouldn't do that, because leaving the channel is of course a risk, even if it's just a few ships. So in the beginning, the Battle of Britain, the presence of the Royal Air Force, it was there, and it was also during the Kanalkampf marked by the Germans, is that we keep running into Allied fighters, but it wasn't a very concentrated effort. And this is also something you see in the kill numbers or the victory numbers by both sides. Yeah, the losses are fairly limited, even among the Stukas and so on. Even though they're called back essentially after the Kanalkampf, a little bit more into phase 2 they served as well. But you can see that the fighting wasn't that severe yet, but that the Germans were in fact able to inflict significant damage upon the targets that they chose on any given day.
So basically we can say the Kanalkampf, the attack in the Channel, was successful, and it also put Britain on a back foot. So
yes, I mean there's two things that you can maybe add to that, because the Kanalkampf happened very soon after the Battle of France was over, right? And during the Battle of France, I think the Luftwaffe 2 and Luftwaffe 3 together, they lost about 30% of their fighting force. So that translates into roughly 3,000 men, or that's air crew. Obviously, you have to take into account that this is not 3,000 pilots, right? It's air crew. So on a bomber, you have a couple of them. And they had, I don't know, 1,500 wounded or something like that. So they are at this point recuperating from a major campaign against a major power on the European continent. And even though the Germans won, they did suffer quite significant losses in the air. I mean, 30% of your force of Luftwaffe 2 und 3 is quite substantial. So with the forces that they had at this time, they did relatively well, and you could probably say that the Kanalkampf was 1-0 for Germany. Although if they had a little bit more time to recuperate, perhaps, if there had been a little bit more, maybe a shift in the internal Luftwaffe order of battle, where some of the other Luftwaffe would send their fighters, then maybe more could have been done. But that's a topic of discussion that we can maybe talk about later on again.
So now another major problem or shortcoming was that the Luftwaffe didn't realize that Great Britain had a strategic air defense, and this was basically the first strategic air defense on this level. Basically, it's how's it called? A command and control and information system.
Yeah.
And that it was integrated with the whole radar change system. The Germans also had radar, but they basically used it on a very tactical level. I think they used it for landing or some basic stuff, but never on. They never coordinated that information, as far as I know from the Cambridge history of the Second World War. And this is also the reason why the Germans never really understood what was happening, because to a certain degree, the British could always send up planes when the Germans were coming, so they didn't need patrols that much, which also meant they had less operational losses, less stress on the pilot, less usage of the planes, fuel, wear and tear and everything. So one way would have been to attack the radar stations, which I think initially was done but then was stopped. The question is, would have had been possible to damage the radar stations sufficiently enough to damage this whole strategic air defense?
So a few things here. First of all, the idea that the Luftwaffe didn't really, or the Germans didn't really take account of radar and so on. To a certain degree, that is true. You see a major shift in that happening very soon after the Battle of Britain, when the Germans realize, that radar thing, that really is good. But the Germans did have radar before that. But for them, since they were on the offensive most of the time, it had little value at this point in the war of really thinking about major investments in that regard. Later on, of course, we see a complete shift, as I said. Then that the Brits didn't fly too many patrols because they have radar, yes and no. It really depends on what stage of the Battle of Britain we're talking about, and also what kind of mission the Luftwaffe flew. If the Luftwaffe flew one of their let's say raids, for example, they did this very early on during the Battle of Britain with Dornier 17s, where they would come in low, fast, and drop bombs on airfields. Then they could achieve tactical surprise. However, if they had to strike something that is further inland, or if they had to come with a huge kind of bulk of planes and drop bombs on a specific target from high altitude, then that tactical surprise was lost, because the Brits did have enough time to scramble their fighters. Generally, there were always fighters in the air for the Brits, and they were always delegated to go to the places where essentially the Germans were suspected of heading. And you read some of the accounts of Dornier 17 pilots who had to hit something inland, and initially they were always surprised that there was some kind of fighter presence there. They didn't really understand what was going on, but it really soon dawned on them that, of course, the Brits do have this kind of communication and radar system that helps them in that regard. One of the issues that you can't forget is that when a German bomber attack, or just normal German attack, goes towards Britain, all the different Gruppen and Geschwaders meet up. So you have the bombers going to a specific area at the coast of France or inside of France, circling around there, waiting for a certain deadline, and then they head out to Britain. And the same thing is for the fighters. Now, the fighters initially would screen the bombers, which is also obviously something that tells the Brits, okay, something is happening here. We better send up fighters. So they send up fighters and they start dueling with the ME-109s. And then, of course, they hold some of these planes in reserve to attack the bombers. So the amount of tactical surprise in that regard is completely lost because you're on a time schedule, and you don't really go up into the air, fly immediately to Britain, drop your bombs, and get out.
Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, they also, even without the radar, they would have probably picked up enough chatter and the signal.
Oh yeah, I mean the Germans had horrible radio discipline during the Battle of Britain. You
So-
often hear this in British accounts that they could hear the Germans chatting on the coastline. They heard the Germans chatting over in France. So I'm not 100% sure how much truth there is in that, but since I've never really read in the chronicles, I have a couple of chronicles of the Kampfgeschwaders and the Jagdgeschwaders that flew in the Battle of Britain, and I don't remember seeing ever it written that they maintained radio silence, because usually something like that is written in the accounts, right?
Yeah.
It's crucial. So yeah, I think in that way it's kind of an own goal, and also it's even without radar, it would be pretty hard to hide a huge gargle of bombers coming to Britain when you have observers all along the coastline. Yeah. Now, of course, by the time they're up there and by the time the Brits will then get their aircraft in the air, you have to phone the dispatcher. The dispatcher then has to relay that. From there, it goes to the squadrons. From there, it goes to the pilots. Those are scrambled and so on. You lose maybe 15 minutes or something if you're lucky. So you do lose a certain amount of tactical surprise, but the way that it was handled by the Brits was pretty well done. So
basically, there was no real way around the strategic air defense. It's interesting.
Well, there are a couple of days when the Luftwaffe went out when there was a lot of cloud cover. And initially, they didn't really like flying with cloud cover because obviously it would mean flying at lower altitudes where they can drop their bombs. But some of their Kampfgeschwaders were actually quite happy to do so. Some of their pilots were quite happy to do so because they knew that they can fly towards Britain, covered more or less by clouds, not always, because over the channel, clouds apparently don't form that much, apparently geographical thing. But then over Britain, they once again have clouds, then they have to drop down at a certain time to drop their bombs, but then they can go back into the clouds. And at this point in time, for a British pilot up in the air, it's absolutely useless if the radar operator tells him, look, you have 5 Heinkel 111s right in front of you, 1 o'clock, 1 mile out, if you can't see the bloody things. So clouds and the weather played a big role in the Battle of Britain, sometimes to the Germans' advantage, but sometimes also on the British advantage, because sometimes there were days when the Germans wouldn't attack because the weather was so bad. And those days were crucial for the Brits to repair their airfields, to get new fighter planes to the front lines, to the groups, instruct pilots, give them a day of rest, and so on. And that plays a huge regard in this engagement as well.
So this is quite interesting. Before I've come to a previous or a first conclusion, which already formed in my mind, I mean, on the tactical side, as far as I know, one main problem was that the Germans were pretty good in gaining air superiority, usually with just sending the fighters in on freie Jagd, as far as I know, on free hunt, basically. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't do this in the Battle of Britain, or they weren't allowed to, so they were always stuck to the bombers, which also meant that they couldn't really engage the English fighters very well. And in that regard, if they went like, okay, we just send our fighters in and try to hunt the enemy planes, and then later on send the bombers in, would this have been a viable tactical change?
Well, the Luftwaffe changed their ways of operating at least a fighter squadrons, maybe 3 times during the Battle of Britain. During the Kanalkampf, I think it would be fair to say, as I said earlier, that the German Jackeschwaders were pretty much, giving the Brits a good blow. Also because the fighter tactics of the Brits at that point were still a bit archaic. But they learned very quickly, and they adopted different tactics. They adopted more loose formations, and flew in a more flexible supporting role between the different flights. But at this point in the Kanalkampf, you definitely have a German superiority when it comes to the fighters that go out and screen the attacking force. And you see this all the way, I think, until mid-August or late August, when the German fighters are then finally, or sadly in a way, or tragically, maybe that's the best word, told to escort the bombers directly. And this is a major problem. Now, the Germans, of course, realized that when after a couple of times that it worked, afterwards it didn't, but the Germans realized that the Brits don't really send out their fighters anymore to attack the German escorts, like the screening force. Because obviously the Brits have learned that if they attack just the fighters, more of the bombers will come through. So they were waiting a little bit, ignored the screening force, which obviously at some point had to head back because they were out of fuel, and then attack the bombers. So that's why they switched them to a direct escort of the bombers, which in many ways wasn't good enough either. And later on, they realized, of course, when the Americans were coming over and over Germany, that a screening force is important. But even then, the Americans were frustrated with the fact that the Germans never attacked the screening force and only went after the bombers. So you see the kind of same chess game being carried out there. So when the fighters were then later instructed to fly with the bombers, they still weren't able to adequately defend the bombers simply because they lost essentially their edge. They had to fly with the formation, which makes them slow down. It's not that they fly wing on wing. They usually fly a little bit higher, making kind of these figure of 8 movements above them. But they're not able to intercept the British fighters before bombers get hit, and that's really the big problem at that point. Now, I think I don't actually think that I completely answered your question, but yeah.
I think you did. So, based on this information and everything else before, because I now come to a different conclusion which I had before this talk, which is quite interesting, because when we look at the bigger picture again, Hitler already in summer 1940 decided to attack Russia and started preparation for Operation Barbarossa. So if we take into account that the Luftwaffe looks clearly at what was achieved in France, in the Battle of France, that the strategic bombing there was clearly not enough, and that major parts of the Battle of Britain would not work out as planned, and then also realize to a certain degree when they start that the damage is not enough, that they change the strategy and just keep attacking in the channel and the outer areas, so that the fighter command actually has to come out and don't fly into Britain, but keeping the pressure on the shipping lanes, of course in coordination with the Kriegsmarine. So in a way to keep the pressure on Britain, and also don't call the Battle of Britain off, because some claim, I need to refute it, how true this is, that Hitler also kept the Battle of Britain on in order to mask Barbarossa, so that Stalin and the other side is okay, he's still fighting with the British and not moving all his troops over there. So basically to keep the Battle of Britain going, but also in this way they would reduce severely the number of losses of pilots, because every pilot shot down over Britain was basically killed in action or missing in action, whereas I think in the Kanalkampf they were still pretty good in rescuing downed pilots. You know more about that?
Yeah, so it would be a very costly diversion if this was really the thinking behind it. Now, it's possible that, of course, that later on the night bombings, because the Battle of Britain really extends further than we usually talk to, right?
The point is, it was already very costly
Yes.
and how it played out, and way more costly than it would have been with this, let's say, moderate strategy, and not with the head against the wall, which was still, in my part, the assessment of the Battle of Britain from the German side nowadays.
Yeah. So, to maybe address the question that you asked last with the rescued pilots, essentially. Of course, Britain had the advantage of fighting over home turf, which means that a pilot that is hit with his plane and knows that he has to bails out over friendly territory, and that means that within a couple of hours he will be back at the airfield that he's serving at. Sometimes it will take a day. Usually it took only a couple of hours, because the Brits were very quick in transporting their shot down pilots from left to right, essentially, in a manner of speaking. The Germans, of course, didn't have that advantage. But you should also, this is something that a lot of people, I think, forget, is that when a British fighter was hit, he had a much easier time of returning to the airfield and getting repairs. A lot of the German planes that could potentially have been repaired and go up a couple of days later once again on an offensive operation couldn't do so, because their distance to home and distance to the coast of France was too long. Which of course means that you not only use the plane, but you also lose the pilot. Now the pilots bailing out on over the canal were rescued by both sides usually, if they were found. Of course, if a British ship or a British rescue plane sees a German pilot, it will save him, rescue him, because you're not always sure who it is. First of all, you don't really see the uniform, but also by rescuing a German pilot, you are keeping him from being rescued down the line by a German rescue team. The Germans initially used a lot of planes in this endeavor, trying to find their own pilots that were downed. Now, there are some cases apparently of these being intercepted by RAF fighters. And the German, I think I read one statistics that initially during the Kanalkampf, the rescue squadrons of the Germans saved 100 pilots, but lost 50 pilots themselves. Wow. So this is pretty bad in every manner of speaking. But both sides certainly did try to save the pilots that were in the canal or the channel. The Brits probably, it's hard really to say who had the advantage, because it always depends on where exactly does the pilot jump off.
Let me interrupt here. If the Germans lost too many pilots, rescuing pilots above the channel, then a lot of the fighter command must have been engaged there. So basically, the whole strategy to just fight over the channel would have been sufficient to wear down at least the fighter command, probably similarly as they did, but clearly not sufficiently, but also keeping their own losses relatively low.
Well, the thing is that after an offensive operation, the German fighters are usually back at their base. So let's say they're doing a screening force for the bombers. That means they go ahead of the bombers. They fight a little bit with the Brits. They go back to France. The bombers get attacked. While the bombers are en route back, the German fighters go up again, save the bombers that are coming back from the attacks of the British planes, and then land together with the bombers. Now, during that time after, there's going to be quite a number of pilots in the canal. And during this time, the Brits were usually able to muster enough planes to patrol the canal and to find these kind of stranded or these kind of lone rescue planes. I'm not quite sure how much of concentrated effort there was. I think this was mainly done by chance, essentially. There's a patrol of, let's say, British planes that just checks that nothing else is coming, or that is up in the air to make sure that something is able to intercept a new German wave, and it sees one of these rescue planes and then it shoots it down, and so on. I'm not quite sure if the Germans had sufficient enough machines to actually cover their own retreat, and after that also cover the canal once again for a couple of hours. because the Germans didn't actually have that many planes during the Battle of Britain. Usually their numbers usually they flew pretty much exactly at the maximum force they had with each mission on each given day.
Of course,
and they didn't really have any tactical.
But of course, in this case, we have a smaller range if we only fight above the channel, which also probably should limit the number of losses and everything, and also the time in the air.
Yeah, I mean, it depends because first of all, if a plane is hit, let's say, if a fighter plane is hit, it's not going to be allowed to go up immediately again. The damage is going to have to be assessed, and that does increase the amount of time where the plane is grounded on the ground. However, I think there is one statistics that the Brits had, that it took them roughly 30 minutes to get a fighter back into the air after it landed, which is also the reason why the Brits have so many sorties during the Battle of Britain, because one fighter could theoretically perhaps go up 3 times and attack the same force of Germans coming into Britain, because they were able to quickly restock, refuel them, and give enough time to the pilot to rest as well for a couple of minutes. For the Germans, I'm not quite sure if there is a statistic that is similar. I would expect it to be that the time required would be pretty much the same. But yeah, like I said, I don't have the statistics so I can't really say if that's true or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite. But I think there's still, not a strategy to win the Battle of Britain, but a viable strategy, because we shorten the line for the Germans, and we also extend the line for the British if we fight only above the channel.
Yes, and that's what the Brits realized after Battle of Britain, and once they did their missions over France and their rhubarb attacks, or whatever they were called, that they ran into the same issues that the Luftwaffe had, and they had some horrendous casualties as well. And some of those were, of course, pilots that were unable to return to their airfield, simply because of the geographical distance that there was between them and safety, essentially.
So, we have a question here from Hannah Firewolf. Could you elaborate on the idea of attritional air war? I think I read the Brits produced more planes and trained more pilots than the Germans, fighters and fighter pilots at least. Do you know the numbers? I have the numbers in my video, basically, but from the cuff, I know that the British produced way more fighters than the Germans. The German initially intelligence was very spot on with how many planes the British had, but they were completely off in regards how many planes they would produce. So at a certain point, basically the Germans were fighting phantom planes because they couldn't be there, because both sides, the British and the Germans, assumed their industry capacity to be about the same as the other. So the Germans, I think, assumed the British could build, 270 planes or something per month, and basically build, almost 600. And the British assumed that the Germans could build 600, but could only produce 300 or something. And for the pilots in my third Battle of Britain video, I think I have the exact numbers there. But the thing is, for the pilots that were captured during the Battle of Britain, the German ones, I think only 2 or 3 were not trained before the war. Basically, the Luftwaffe lost all their men trained before September 1939. So they lost basically men with more than 1 year of experience. So this is also, the attrition in this regard is very, very important, and also later in Barbarossa. The Germans always lost their best men and the best material, whereas the Allies usually didn't have the experience in the war. So in the beginning, the best Germans were fighting the, not green, but usually not those well-experienced Allies, because they had no experience, because Germans first attacked Poland, then before that was Spain. So always you have this diversion, and this is also the reason why in the beginning usually Germany is pretty good, and then at a certain point it drops down, because they can't sustain the numbers, or at least they can sustain the numbers, but they can't sustain the quality of replacements, and this is very important.
Yeah, so I'm just looking for my books to actually find a statistic on that, but I'm not able to find a definite number. In my head, I somehow have this figure of 1,000 planes a month produced by Germany. But I think that's
No,
slightly too high. That
Wait,
can't
I
be.
have production numbers here per week for Hurricanes and Spitfires. And it's from June to November 1940, and the total of Hurricanes was produced was 2,367 and
Yeah.
724 Spitfires. This is from Overy. The Battle
Do
of
we have
Britain.
something on the Luftwaffe though? Because that's the one
From the
that I was
Luftwaffe,
just thinking.
I don't have. Wait, I think I should have it here in my another book. I have all the books laid out. Herr Meyer, Herr Klaus Meyer should have wrote this article. Yes, this is at least correct. And yeah, the intelligence officer assumed that the Royal Air Force had around 900 planes. And this was almost correct, yeah. And the production.
I was close.
Here. He assumed a month production of 180 to 200 fighter planes. Yet the British produced 470 fighter planes. So now.
Yeah, that's the numbers I have as well.
But do I have numbers on the Germans? I know that the Germans produced less. So.
You mean fighters or planes?
This was fighters.
Because for overall planes, the Germans produced more, obviously.
I think this could, but I think the difference was rather small in total. Anyway.
But yeah, I mean, while you looked at, I mean, the point that I would probably make here is, during the Battle of Britain, what the Brits need are fighters. What the Germans need are fighters and bombers. So you see this with quite a number of British pilots, for example, that they were drawn from the bomber force and put into fighters. So they could kind of shuffle their air force and their pilots that way. Of course, it takes a little bit time to train this guy, but somebody who has already flight experience is going to be more susceptible to a different kind of plane than somebody who has absolutely no experience flying an aircraft. So for the Germans, trying to replace their losses is pretty darn, difficult. Whereas for the Brits, they can always shuffle around a bit. And even if they just keep the balance of power between them and the Germans at an acceptable level, even if that means that they have slightly less, it's good enough because the strategic advantage is with them.
So to come back to the conclusion again, I mean, basically, I don't think there was any way the Germans could have won the Battle of Britain unless there was a major political or moral shift happening, like something like a new government and say, okay, enough, we want peace. Would you agree on that, or would you say with a certain strategy and improvement in tactics, it would be winnable?
Well, let's go on with the assumption and say that that the first phase of the Battle of Britain, the Canal Kampf, was in a way a German victory. Let's go with that assumption. Now, it's not without its discussion, but let's go with that assumption nonetheless. Now, in August, then you do see the Germans shuffling their attacks away from the shipping and the ports to airfields close to the channel. I always want to say canal, but always, channel. And you also sometimes see attacks on the radar installations, and those do produce a certain amount of damage. Now, in mid-August, you of course have Adlertag, Eagle Day, where I think about 2,000 something planes were used by the Luftwaffe. I think it was 2,400, something like that, on a day. And this is really where they are at their high point. And they just gone out of the Canal Kampf, which in a way was a German victory, but not enough, of course, to completely cripple the RAF. And they go into August and they launch this huge offensive. And you see on both sides, the casualties are mounting. Now, if the attacks would have continued at this point, and also into September, as they started hitting the factories and the airfields, at this point, the Brits have quite a substantial amount of issues replacing their aircraft. They have enough pilots by this point. They don't have the aircraft. that they might need to really keep this fight going. One of the things that you, for example, hear in the British after action reports in a way, or analysis of the Battle of Britain, is that their production went down because of fighter planes went down in a way because they were lacking some crucial components to create aircraft, for example, magnetos or something like that for the engines to work. And the factories that were hit, while they were being repaired the whole time, while they were put back into action as soon as they could, you do see the Luftwaffe scoring some interesting victories in that regard. Now, you can, of course, and this is the argument that everybody makes, essentially, if the Luftwaffe would just have continued their concentrated attacks on the airfields and the factories, then maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, they could have had victory. The question you have to ask yourself after that, what is victory going to look like for the Germans? Because in a way, the Germans have to keep up that pressure until the Brits surrender. If the Brits refuse to surrender, well, you either need Operation Sea Lion, or you need to keep this offensive going for whole time. And the German production and replacement for their own fighter pilots wasn't high enough. And especially when you then think about Hitler trying to invade the Soviet Union and doing it as well, you're not in a good situation at that point. You would need to have production figures that the Germans had maybe in 1944, or maybe 1943, but mostly in 1944, to sustain an air offensive of this magnitude throughout the months or the weeks or months where the Brits didn't surrender, because that is a possibility. They're an island after all.
Yeah, I think the thing is, I mean, I go mostly with the assumption which is here from in the Cambridge history of Second World War, where they state if the Germans would have continued their attack, they still would have lost, just less quickly or badly. And because the problem is the margin was too big. And for me, this is why I think the other strategy would have worked. Basically, the Battle of Britain was not, even if the Battle of Britain would have been won, I don't think Sea Lion would have a good chance, because the Kriegsmarine basically had no ships left. And
well, considering that nobody ever planned anything concretely on Operation Sea Lion. I mean, let's say the Battle of Britain was won in September 1940.
It's basic. I think it's
What do they do?
almost all. At that point, I'm not sure how the channel is, because the problem also with D-Day was they had to look at the weather and everything, because it's quite tricky with the tides and everything. So this is what I mean. The Americans and the British lost quite a few men and equipment during the landing just due to weather and other stuff. And this was in June. I don't know exactly if the channel is more calm in fall, but I don't think so. And the other part is the logistics. You need, even if you land the troops successfully, you need bring over the logistics. So, but back to my actual conclusion. So basically, the Battle of Britain, if they would have really looked closely and understood the situation, they could have determined, okay, we can't win the Battle of Britain by attacking Britain itself. So we just keep the Kanalkampf on and try to hit as much shipping as possible, and maybe doing night raids on major ports that are inland, which in order to do some damage there on the overfilled ports, because I mean, if they're overcrowded with people and also overcrowded with material, you're more likely to hit something or do more damage. And then also keep the pressure on Britain on, and also reduce your own losses, and also have the diversion on to basically keep Stalin off Barbarossa.
Yeah, well, at that point, you can also make the argument that the Brits would have simply, found alternatives. They would have gone to send their shipping to Scotland and so on. And in a matter of a way, I think they even did that during the Battle of Britain. So there's always tactical flexibility, strategic flexibility for the Brits, simply because they're an island.
Of course. I mean, it's not about winning, it's more keeping the pressure up to a certain degree, because I guess the British also wouldn't have gave up the channel completely.
Yeah. But the thing is, if the Brits keep up the channel completely, and if they don't really send any kind of reinforcements there, you might as well bomb, the ports, the city, the airfields. If there's nothing on them, those victories are useless because the Brits are just building up inland, and at some point they're going to hit you with a fighter force that you might not are able to match, simply because attrition does set in for you, mechanical failures next to AA. And considering that they will probably send up a couple of fighters as well, but if they were able to build up a force inland and then send it out, in a way abandoning the coastal area for a certain time and then hit back, you're going to take losses that you're maybe not expected to take.
Yeah, but the thing is, the strategic bombing attacks on the factories, did they do any damage at all that was sufficient? I mean, you mentioned before they were missing parts, but I actually never read anywhere that the bombing attacks were successful in doing any long-lasting damage at all. And even if you look at Germany, how much it was bombed, it still was limited.
The thing is that it's not long-lasting because you would attack one factory, you would bomb it. You would attack another factory, you would bomb it. Then another one, you would bomb it. Another one, you would bomb it. And then you would go back to the first one you bombed. And while all the time...
But were they doing the sufficient amount of damage? And were they hitting also?
Well, hitting is yes and no. I mean, first of all, the German bombers weren't carrying their full bomb load, which is not good. And especially once they hit targets further inland. The further you go, the less bomb load you can take. And then hitting with the stuff they were hitting, so they have like 50 kilogram bombs, 250 kilogram bombs. Those bombs are able to inflict some damage, but they're not really enough to permanently knock out a factory, at least not in the way the Germans could concentrate their bomber forces on one specific factory. And then with it being repaired, and granted, it might be destroyed again, but the Germans never, the time frame where they really started hitting factories, it was just maybe 2 weeks. And if you look at how Germany was bombed, like you said afterwards in 44, 45, it was bombed for months, and it still was able to produce.
So then I don't get your initial argument that just attacking the Channel area would have created a problem that suddenly a lot of Spitfires and Hurricanes would turn up.
Well, because let's go with the assumption that the Germans win the Channel, but the Brits don't surrender, because the Brits know they have the island. Now, at this point, the Germans don't have any effective planning for Operation Sea Lion. Now, if you think about D-Day, that was an operation that was planned for I don't know how long.
Yeah.
The Germans didn't even start planning Sea Lion. Like I said initially, there was no liaison between, for example, the Air Force and the Army until like September during the Battle of Britain. There was no planning whatsoever. But let's go with the assumption that the Germans win the Canal Kampf and they can keep air superiority above the Channel. And that the Brits simply say, okay, we can't match this. We don't have the fighters. We don't have the planes. We have to take a step back and recuperate our losses. In a manner of speaking, like the Germans did at one point before Operation Bodenplatte, where they completely pulled back the Air Force and just built it up for a couple of weeks. Until they could finally field an air force that could potentially take on the Allies again. Of course, the Germans then squandered it. But the Brits could do the same and say, okay, we're just going to abandon. We're just going to use flak and AA to keep the Germans on their toes. And we're going to produce inland. And once we have enough fighters, we're going to come back. And at this point, the Allies might not, the Germans might not be able to withstand the renewed offensive because they're whittled down by months of fighting. Because you got to think about the psychological stress of these pilots that keep going over the canal, over the channel. I've for example, Kampfgruppe, what was it, 51, I think. I read one account of a pilot falling asleep at the controls, only waking up a couple of, maybe in half an hour later to see his whole crew being asleep. This is the kind of psychological and physical fatigue that these guys were dealing with during the actual battle. Now, think about trying to sustain that for a couple of months or weeks. Weeks or months, it's impossible.
I mean, the thing is, if the British turn back on the Channel, they also don't have to keep as much pressure up. So, I mean, this also would mean the Luftwaffe to a certain degree would adapt. And the thing is, if they've only fired above the channel and it's mainly a diversion strategy, you also don't have to put in every effort like they did. For me, it's basically I'm looking, okay, how the Battle of Britain could have been made less of a loss for the Germans, basically, while not completely giving up on it.
Yeah, I mean, sustaining the Canal Kampf would have probably been the best alternative at that point, especially considering that the Germans never really thought ahead of what happens after they, quote unquote, win the Battle of Britain.
Yeah, it's what there was no strategy at all. That was also
So
a main problem.
yeah, so we agree on that. The only concern that I have at that point is that the Battle of Britain extended edition, let's say, the Canal Kampf, that keeps, for a couple of years, you need enough fighters and bombers there to make a difference, to inflict damage on the Brits, but not enough or not too many to detract from your operations in the east that you're going to launch. Where is that balance? Especially with the production figures and the training figures that we have with the Germans at that time. There would have to be a huge effort to get those in line with the operational needs of the Luftwaffe in 1940, 1941, and later 1942. And if you look at the shipping that was sunk after the Battle of Britain with the Condor, like the Focke-Wulf 200s and so on, it's there's a worthy discussion there, I think. But with the planes that you had at that point, with the 109, the Heinkels, I'm not quite sure those are the planes that are suited for that kind of operation. I'm more inclined to maybe lean towards the Ju-88s at that point. Although the Heinkels could, of course, carry torpedoes, and they did during the war, and they did some substantial damage, especially in the Arctic, to the Brits or to the Allies. But you really need a dedicated force to hit shipping and just shipping.
Yeah.
And I'm not quite sure if the Germans had it at that point.
The point is, I mean, what I see is the Luftwaffe lost a lot of pilots during the Battle of Britain and a lot of planes and basically just don't go in, lose less pilots, lose less planes, just because the smaller range, and then go into Operation Barbarossa, let's say with 10 or 20% more of your experienced pilots. So basically it's just not bleeding as much as they did. It's not about winning, it's just not losing as badly. And I think this is probably the most viable way to do it. And also the thing is, they could have done it from the knowledge and the setup they had, I think. Because some people say, yeah, okay, if you change in 1939 that they produce like more of this plane or they train more on attacks on ships, then okay, yeah, that's different.
This also bases itself on the assumption that the Brits would continue to fight. That's a stupid sentence, but yeah, continue to fight in the way they did during the short period of the Canal Kampf.
Of course. I mean,
and they wouldn't do that.
But the thing is also, but if they change, if they don't attack, the Luftwaffe don't lose more planes. So, but if they attack, the battle would be fought in a more even territory.
That's true.
So I can see a way how the Luftwaffe in this case would have more losses, unless they make a real, I don't know, more against the wall than the Battle of Britain was, in my opinion, for most of the part, because it didn't achieve very much.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the generally, if we want to talk about the biggest mistake, let's say, that would probably be switching targets for this third time to civilian areas. Before that, you do have the attacking factories and airfields and radar installation. You do have significant losses, especially after Adlertag, when Germany is just sending everything they have in Luftwaffe 2 and 3. So just keeping the Canal Kampf going, I'm not really entirely convinced, because it does assume that the propositions for the Brits would not change in the way that you say we're going to keep our losses down in the way that we did during the Canal Kampf. I think the Brits would find ways to counter the Germans, especially by ramping up their fighter production and pilot training. but it is probably a worthwhile argument to make, that just keeping in the canal, as you said, would be an even playing field in a way, because while shipping will probably be closer to the English coast than to the French coast, the odds are more even, let's say,
Yeah, a more even
than later
playing
on.
field, not an even playing field, a more even, because every kilometer counts if you're in a damaged plane. And
Yes.
if we're fighting above the channel, and if it's just one kilometer away from the English coast, it's far more closer than above London. Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, actually, on that, a quick note: the Germans had all kind of statistics and tips they gave to pilots, where they said, like, okay, if you lose your engine at this altitude, at this geographical location, you will be able to glide all the way to France or not. So they actually worked those things out, which is quite interesting to think. So some pilots would say, okay, I won't be able to make it. Might as well just jump now. Or they would say, okay, I can get close enough to the coast of France where I have a high chance of being saved by a boat or by a rescue plane. Or okay, I have enough time. I can sail all the way to France and bail there or crash land. So there were actually just as kind of tidbit trivia, there was this kind of science, let's say, behind it, and then the pilots were instructed in the kind of altitudes they would have to keep at certain levels to be able to get back there.
Okay, I would say I think we wrap this up basically with a small Q&A session, or do you have anything to add?
No, I think we basically gone through it. I mean, it's a huge topic, and I'm sure a lot of people have commented and given alternatives to what we've been saying, and are going. I don't know if you're going to actually put this on your channel afterwards as a definite upload. So it's a huge topic. We can talk about it all day. We can assume and think and brainstorm about possible tactics all day long. But yeah, I think this is pretty good. Let's do a Q&A.
So, do we have any questions? Ideally, address them at Bismarck or at Military History Visualized, because if you put the ad before, we will see it. It will start out better for us. So it will be marked and easier visible. Would you say the Battle of Britain was a battle of attrition? What do you say, Bismarck?
Yes. In many ways, yes. I mean, maybe not anticipated as one, although the Germans did say we want to whittle down Britain. But the way it ended up, yes. Germany couldn't sustain the losses they were having, and Britain was just about able to do it. But also that depends a lot on how you look at the figures, and especially the returning pilots, where the Brits had the upper hand. They had way more returning pilots that returned to service than the Germans did.
Next question would be, how did the German air doctrine change after the Battle of Britain?
Well, the first big blow to them was, of course, that the Stuka wasn't anymore considered with only glazed up eyes and marvel. However, the Operation Barbarossa returned the Stuka, the Ju-87, to its quote-unquote former glory in the German armed forces, where the signs of the time were essentially ignored, and that the Stuka was no longer able to really operate in an environment in the same environment that it had operated before. Some of the Germans certainly realized that the lack of strategic bombers could hound them in the future. But there was never a really concentrated effort and a really a complete understanding of this in the Luftwaffe and in the industry. So yeah, that's just a quick question. I could go into it way more, but there you go.
The next I will take, could the Germans have sunk more ships with kamikaze tactic at the cost of pilots and planes, worth it or not? As far as I know at that point, definitely not worth it. And also, as far as I know, Hitler was very opposed against any suicide attacks for basically nearly, well, unless the final months when I think he didn't care at all anymore. And so this would have not been possible at all, I think. Halmer Feuerwolf, Any chances and videos about the German unity wars? Yes, at a certain point, definitely. I need to read up on those and everything. But I think I will cover Prussia beforehand. So,
And can I quickly say something about the kamikaze?
yeah, of course.
So it would be extremely hard to convince a German pilot at the time to send himself into a ship or to crash himself into a ship if you have the ability to just give him a bomb and drop the bomb into the ship and get the hell out. The German pilots weren't thinking that way. And yes, I know a lot of people have this kind of idea, especially later on with what's that kamikaze ramming squadron again? I lost their name at the moment. It's on the tip of my tongue.
Jagdgeschwader Elbe.
Yeah, genau.
Sonderkommando
Elbe. That's the one. Actually, interestingly enough, that the guy who made the Wilde Sau had a Wilde Sau idea was the same guy who had the Sonderkommando Elbe idea. At that point, the Sonderkommando Elbe had absolutely no impact. There were so little of them. There were so little pilots that could actually be convinced to do that. It was simply not in the German mindset. Especially in 1940, you're not going to get a single German pilot who says, yes, I'm going to do that.
Good. The next is at me. Would Germany have won if they put 88mm guns on the aircraft? Oh, this more shit and giggles doctrine. Yeah, that's more shit and giggles doctrine approach, I would say. At Bismarck, would a unilateral German ceasefire against the British help the British more or the Germans more to build up forces for later engagement?
British. Because the Germans have to come to the Brits. The Brits hold the advantage in a way, simply by the fact that they're an island. And let's say, if we would say that the Germans had the production figures of 1943 even, maybe the Germans. But the production figures and the training figures of the Germans to mount an operation of this case, and after a ceasefire where the Brits had recuperated their losses and had learned something from the past action, I think you're going to have a tougher proposition. The fact that the Germans did so well, quote unquote, during the Kanalkampf was because the Brits weren't ready for it.
So next look,
there's the one on the contribution of non-British pilots to the Battle of Britain. I think there were 3 Polish squadrons and 1 Czech one. So especially in the beginning, this is crucial because Britain had to build up their force, and 4 squadrons out of I'd have to go back into my figures 1 second. I actually have written something down on this.
Thank you, dude.
So we have with number 11 group, number 12 and number 13, we have roughly math. This is hard. We have roughly 40 squadrons on the 1st of July. 4 of them are non-British, as far as I know. 3 Poles, one Czechoslovakian or Czech. So that's 10% of the force. That's pretty good. It's important. Yeah, definitely.
There's a nice question from Connor D. Bismarck and MHV, would blitzing Malta and the rest of the Mediterranean and driving out the British, taking Suez and Iraq, Persian oil be a better strategic decision than fighting the Battle of Britain? Well, the problem is this is quite hard to do because I think you need to launch the Africa Corps and then to get to the Suez Canal. It's quite difficult, and also Malta at the same time. So I think it's...
the Germans did considerable damage to Malta, especially if you compare it to the previous Italian effort.
Yeah.
Which, I don't want to make too much fun of the Italians. Their planes let them down in many ways, especially their bombers let them down in many ways. But the Germans did do considerable damage to Malta. The problem is also Malta's geographical location. I know I've personally been to Malta last summer or the summer before that. I can't remember. I would hate to be the one that has to invade Malta. Yes, it's a small island, but it's a bitch to navigate. Even with the relatively good infrastructure they have over there now. And considering the geographical location, this distance the Germans had to fly, you have German planes that were simply hitting one of their engines, and they had to shut it down, and they could still make that return trip from Britain to France, but they couldn't. There was no way they could go from Malta to Italy or to Sicily with the distance. So it would have to have been a way bigger effort probably to crack Malta than the Germans could ever mount at that point in time.
Yeah, I agree on that, and also that Suez is not so easy. And I think Iraqi and Persian oil back then was far less than most other parts. That's the problem. We are thinking of the oil we have now in the Middle East, but back then I think they were the oil sources were mainly different.
Well, they weren't as much established.
Yeah,
They didn't find all the springs and so on. A lot of the springs were deeper than they could dig and blah blah blah.
Yeah. So at Bismarck, what was the contribution? Okay, you answered that already. Was the Russian maneuver to
one on the V2 project? You made a video on that, so
if the V2 project been focused on and had made it to the Battle of Britain, would have had a major difference. Not really, because I mean, this would be it's 4 years faster than it happened, or basically 4 to 5 years faster. And if you looked at my V2 video, you would see how much V2s hit Britain and V1 and V2s together. So even if you have the V1 and the V2, and it was far less than the Germans dropped in the Battle of Britain and bombs. So basically, it was a complete waste of time and money in many ways. It made no sense. I mean, I don't know the number for the V1, it would probably have been different if you had the V1 in 1940, because you can have. I mean, okay, they also intercepted it with the flak, but yeah, it's a bit different. But still, I doubt, because you can't hit anything of substance. You can't aim. You just terror, and terror, as we've seen with Germany, they bombed out Germany, everything, and the Germans. I mean, I don't say they didn't care, but it didn't end the war at all. And if you throw just V1s at Britain in 1940, I guess they would say, so let's have a cup of tea. So
yeah, I think a lot of people are amazed by the technological aspect of the V2, but it wasn't very substantial, its effort in getting anything done.
So then there's another one. What do you know of Austrian participation in the Battle of Britain? Well, the point is, back then, I need to explain this a little more in detail. The point is, what a lot of people don't know, and even most Austrians, at the end of the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved. So there was only Austria left. And Austria was called out as a republic back then, and it was called Deutsch-Österreich, which means German Austria. So in 1918, basically everyone, all parties across the line, conservatives, social democrats, and of course the German nationalists, all wanted an Anschluss in 1918 with Germany. And for instance, the argument of the social democrats was, because they actually read Marx, was with a bunch of peasants, you can't have a socialist revolution, which kind of makes sense unless you're living in the Soviet Union. And I think the original quote is from Otto Bauer: mit einem Haufen Bauernschädel kann man keine sozialistische Revolution machen. This was Austrian, not German, by the way. So when Hitler comes 20 years later, after major economic problems and everything else, a lot of people are for the Anschluss just because it's Germany. And also to a certain degree, of course, because the propaganda of Hitler and everything. So this is the problem. It was not only about the Nazis. It's quite difficult, and even the official history of the Academy of Sciences in Austria nowadays did the history of the empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they have one volume about the nationalities. And you look it up, and they're all in there: Slovenians, Croatians, Germans, but there's no Austrians. And they mentioned back then there were no Austrians. They considered them either Kaisertreu, faithful to the emperor, or Germans, or some other nation. And also another point is in the 19th century, still before, you could be pro-Austria and pro-Germany at the same time. Also the nationalism at a certain point only was exclusive at a later point. So basically you can say in the Second World War that there was a minority, I would say, that really saw them as Austrians, to a certain degree also due to the fight between the Nazis and the Catholic Church was going on, the Kulturkampf and everything, because Austria was predominantly Catholic, and the Nazis tried to implement their anti-Catholic policy before they do it in Germany itself. And to a certain degree, they lost this battle. And one thing is, Austrians always dislike Vienna, the capital. But during the Second World War, they learned that they rather be ruled from Vienna than from Berlin. So in a way, you could say that the Second World War in a way created Austria, or created a better foundation for Austria than the First World War did. Because after the First World War, there was an empire. Before you had an empire, and then you were basically nothing, the small thing left. And now at least you could say, oh, at least we are not Germans, basically. So this is quite complicated. So Austrian position in the Battle of Britain was basically back then the Germans. I don't think most would have made this distinction. Of course, after the war, that changed.
That's a long-winded way of saying that Austria is like Coke Light to Coke. It tries to be the original, but it just doesn't bear up to the magnificence of the real thing.
I just wanted to give a very complicated way of saying it to please your German attitude.
Can I just quickly go back to one of the questions that were asked with the non-British squadrons? There were, I think I said 3 Polish squadrons. There were actually 4 during the Battle of Britain, but 2 of them were bombers and 2 of them were fighters. So just to clear it up. Anyway, next question.
So what was the role of neutral pilots? I think you covered that already.
They weren't really neutral given the fact that they were fighting for one side.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, at Bismarck, speaking of Italy, what was the contribution to the Battle of Britain? It's gonna be a fun one.
Those Italians, crucial contribution medal right there. No, let's be honest. They did send some of their planes. They were fighting against the Brits over the canal. And I will say that it was probably their material and their planes with that were the biggest letdown, not the pilots. On the whole, the pilots, the Italian pilots did relatively well during World War I, given the circumstances they found themselves in. You see this especially later on in the Mediterranean, where they fly their Spaviero bombers into the densest of Allied AA to drop their torpedoes, and not many of them tend to make it out. But they were in a way very courageous, but they just didn't have the material. And they had some of their biplanes there. They had some of their monoplanes, the MC-200s. Those weren't cutting it anymore against the Hurricanes and the Spitfires. They just weren't. You could use those planes maybe against Gladiators or something, but those planes hardly saw service during the Battle of Britain, if at all. in fact. So the Italian contribution was mainly a problem of equipment and not so much of will, because they did send a number of planes to assist the Germans.
So this is an interesting one for you. If the flight radius it was such a problem, why the Germans didn't come up with disposable fuel tanks like the Americans did with the P-51?
The Germans did actually come up with a let's just say, if you think about drop tanks from in the World War II context, everybody thinks of a metal container. During the Battle of Britain, the Germans didn't have that. They had a wooden kind of plywood structure that they shaped into a tank that they then put under their Me-109s. These things leaked like crazy. And the last thing a fighter pilot wants in a fight is a leaking fuel tank below him. And the last thing the fighter pilot wants anyway is a fuel tank below him. And I'm not quite sure if the Germans actually had a provision of jettisoning them like the Allies did later on, that allowed them to get rid of the fuel tank just before an engagement. The few tests that were done with these plywood kind of tanks were not very encouraging. The pilots absolutely hated them, and nobody wanted them. And they said, we rather want to have, depending on where we go, 5 to 20 minutes of action across the channel. I keep saying canal, but then have this fuel tank that is leaking anyway. Because when it's leaking, you don't actually know how much you still have in that bloody thing. So yes, maybe if they had come up with a real metal non-leaking tank, which they later, for example, put on their Stukas, by that time, maybe that would have helped. Actually, I would say that absolutely would have helped. You still have to jettison it when you go into a fight. You don't want to have that thing hanging on you. And actually, a nice little bit of trivia there is that the Allied pilots, when they went over to Germany, at one point, the Air Force tried to tell them, don't jettison your tanks because we keep having to build these tanks, and we don't want to do that. It's a waste of resources. And the Allied pilots essentially told them to, a few non-flattering words and said, we're not going to be in a fight with a fuel tank attached to our plane on the outside. So, that's essentially what that question answered, I think.
Yeah, one question maybe, would an invasion using only Paratrooper be possible if Germany would have won the Battle of Britain? I doubt that, because I think they had only 2 divisions at that point, if at all. Then they had several losses, I think, in Norwegian. Norway, they were limited, I think, the losses, but also in the Battle of France. And paratroopers are very well and very long trained, and usually also, you could say, in a way, expensive. And another point is, even if you get them across, this is light infantry. They are good in fighting, for instance, in urban territory or something. But the other problem is you need to supply them all the time, and they are simply not enough. There's a reason why, if you look at D-Day, how much paratroopers, but there were regular army units also there, or for instance, the invasion of Japan. There were also, I think, they had 1 division of paratroopers, but as a reserve, but they wouldn't have dropped them. They would actually ship them in. So they are a good force, but they are not a force to do a major push usually. This is not a force with which you win a campaign. You win an advantage, you get the initiative, you win a small battle or something, but you don't win a major campaign with it, or you conquer territory with it. It's probably a bit, the only thing where you can do it is basically Hearts of Iron, where you drop a lot of paratroopers and encircle something. But in the Second World War, you can't drop them in a way that they are usually all over the place. It's more like you take 10 pennies or something and throw them in the room, and then you look where they are. This is how paratroopers land back then. And then you have to supply all those different pennies. And they also need to get in touch with radios that are not the best, or the radios are lost, or the batteries get lost, or the battery is damaged, or the battery runs out of power and everything. So paratroopers are basically for initial attack or something, and then and
If
then
you want
you
to
have
see
to
all
link up
the
with a normal troops. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, if you want to see all the advantages and disadvantages that the paratroopers have, look at the invasion of Cyprus. Look at the usage of the German. Yeah.
You mean Creta?
Sorry, Creta. Yeah, that's Cyprus. That's one island too far. Creta. Look at the invasion of Crete. Look at the usage of them at the Belgian forts. Look at Operation Overlord when the Allies dropped them, and then look at Operation Market Garden, and you'll quickly see the strengths of paratroopers and the weaknesses. And then, as well as that, let's look at the logistical side of things. The German, granted, this is 3 years later on, but the Germans completely failed to, for example, resupplied a whole army at Stalingrad from the air. And if they would drop the paratroopers on, let's say, Dover and capture Dover, then they would either have to have a continuous stream of ammunition and men and anything that troops need from Calais to Dover, which is nigh impossible, I would say, to keep up for an extended amount of time, or they would have to fly in the logistics and then the supplies. And I'm not quite sure if the Germans would have been able to do that. And in many ways, I don't think that would have worked out in any way, shape, or form. The Germans would have only lost maybe their best trained troops at that point.
So one for me, do you think the Germans could have intervened during Operation Overlord with U-boats and make some difference? I actually have to read this up, so I can't give any information on that. Projekt Erinnerung, is that the point where Vienna History Museum had let out the 1930s and 40s in the time beam? I don't exactly know. I was there only once, and when I was still in school, and I never looked at it closely. But I've heard some stuff from a German officer who was there, and he was also at the Military History Research Center in Germany, and I think he said he made a remark about certain things. Yeah, so, but this was also 10 years or 15 ago now. Wait, why did Austrians hate Vienna? Well, this is actually quite simple.
Oh, here we go.
You must understand, Vienna originally was in the heart of the empire, and in 1918 I think it had 2 million inhabitants. I think right now it has less, to give you some inclination how big it was. So, and most of the food and everything was, I think, supplied from Hungary and somewhere else. So in 1918, when everything broke down, the Reds were basically, the communists and socialists were in Vienna, and they went out to the rural areas to requisition food. And also Vienna was to the east now and far too big for such a small country. So this is one part. The other part is Germany is the only country I know where it isn't this way, but in most other countries, I always hear the phrase, for instance, I think in Slovenia, or from Slovenians I heard it, Ljubljana, that's not Slovenia, or in Argentina, Buenos Aires, that's not Argentina. So actually, I noticed in many nations quite a dislike for the capital. I assume probably France is quite different because everyone is really fond of Paris, but I'm not sure.
No.
Yeah, well. So basically, most people dislike their capital in general, and in Austria, we do it with even more intensity. And I think it's completely justified. I should add that. And there's this famous statement, Wien bleibt Wien, Vienna stays Vienna, and the next statement is a more devastating statement could not have been made. So Wien bleibt Wien. I think Wien is nice if you want to visit it, but that's about it. I would say, yeah, there are a lot of nice places to visit, but to stay there's something different. So
yeah, to say a thing about France there, Paris is not France and France is not Paris. Like if you've been to Paris and you think you have been to France, no, you were mistaken. You have not been to France. You've been to Paris. It's completely different. Everything about Paris is not French. Like yes, it's French, of course, but it's not France. Go to some other cities, like I don't know, Nantes, for example, or Normandy. That's of course a region, not a city. And you'll see the real, well, quote unquote, the real France, which is way more clean in a way than Paris is. But maybe that doesn't have as many museums. Well, Normandy has a lot of museums, maybe, but yeah.
A comment from JSM 666. I'm not sure having 10% more of the best pilots in Luftwaffe would have changed Barbarossa. I don't think so neither. But the thing is mainly about basically conserving equipment and man while not having any drawback. So it's basically about conserving troops in the long run. I don't think it would have made a major difference in Barbarossa, but usually it can't help if you have a bit more of experienced pilots. So in this regard, this is also if we look at a general, because some people are always asking me, can you do a video how Germany could have won the Second World War? And so I consider different scenarios, and I look at this and I look at that at some point I probably can make a big one and then say, okay, with these factors we have to consider this or something, because I'll probably do several videos on this in the far future where I say, okay, we start at 1936, or we start like the USA is neutral, or we say everything, we start at 1939 and you can't change this, but you can change that factors or something. So it's because the alternate history questions always brings you back to ask the question, what really led the war, what were the major factors that the war turned out in this way, and which you basically saw in this discussion today, because we looked at the primary factors and then we say, okay, if we change that factor, would it adapt, or would the effect be negligible or not? So
just a quick reminder, please put my name, Bismarck, or military history visualized. Wow, I had too much drinks. Too many drinks, too much drinks. Yeah, it's showing. In front of your question, because otherwise we sometimes don't really realize which is, what is a question, what is a comment or a statement. Oh, it's Sheriff.
Sheriff is here, what?
Yeah, but he completely misspelled weird, so I'm not talking to him.
Yes, uploaded. I don't know what this was about. So I look down now, because to what significance did the British anti-aircraft guns assist the RAF in repelling the Luftwaffe's attack? I actually not. I don't know. Do you know, Bismarck? As far as I know, the very limited amount of damage was done, but
yeah, it's very limited. It depends, of course, at what altitude the planes come in. If they come below, let's say, 2,000 meters, the damage that the AA is going to do to the attacking force is going to be way bigger than if they come in at 5,000 meters. That's absolutely normal. As far as I know, one of the things you can look at, for example, is during the night. Of course, during night, the accuracy of the AA is decreased as well. But during the night attacks on London, and even before that, the AA did not really inflict all that substantial losses. We were talking about a handful of planes at this point, if not none sometimes. And because the Brits didn't really have they did have some initiatives, but they didn't have a completely dedicated night fighter branch or force that was really capable of inflicting the kind of damage they would later do, for example, with night fighting mosquitoes. You can be fairly certain to see, the amount of damage that the British AA inflicted during the night, during the Battle of Britain. If you compare that with German, the amount of damage that German flak inflicted on British forces later in the war during the night bombing raids, you would have to say that the Brits probably did a little bit poorer, but of course they didn't also have as many guns, and you have to always, and there weren't as many planes to hit. So you have to see that in that context as well. Overall, the flak was generally pretty good, for example, when attacking the ports, when the Stukas had to attack and so on. Now, hitting a Stuka that is diving straight down is a little bit hard, but hitting a Stuka when it's trying to get out of the area with flak is a little bit easier. So you do see some successes there by British flak, but overall it was against a fighter, it was ineffective, I'd say. It's you have to have it, but on the whole kind of scheme of things, it didn't influence much.
So another question for me with Wildheit. Did Germany try to convince Ireland to take Britain during the Battle of Britain? I actually don't know. Do you know anything about this, Bismarck?
Yeah, like there were some clandestine efforts to get Ireland to essentially, or to get people in Ireland riled up against the Brits and demand independence and so on. There were some political movements in Ireland that did try to do that, kind of revolutionary tendencies and so on, but they didn't get very far. So that's maybe an interesting topic actually for a video for you. But it didn't get very far. There were certainly efforts. There were some clandestine operations, like I said. But in the grand scheme of things, Germany was never really good at mounting covert operations of that magnitude, let's just say.
Yeah. So, anything else? Goering underestimating the importance of radar was the most critical mistake which led to defeat in the Battle of Britain. Agree? Well, no. As I think the Battle of Britain was not really be winnable from the perspective I have, so I don't think that radar in this regard would have changed much. What's your opinion on this, Bismarck? Agree?
No, I mean, I agree more with you.
Okay,
So
trick question.
Yeah, trick question right there. Way to make myself some enemies. No, but it's Goering and the whole high command of Germany, especially with the top placements, they always get a lot of flack for everything that went wrong. And that's also because, and please don't forget this, if you ever read something that unilaterally states that it's somebody's fault, that it's very easy to rub mistakes off to Goering or let's say Hitler. It's very easily done. And just think about yourself, anything that is bad that was said about Hitler, you're more than likely going to believe it without questioning it, because you're going to say, oh yeah, it was him. Or Goering, who in many ways is a ridiculous figure. We all laugh about him being fat and a drug addict and so on. But you got to, look at this from a more contextual perspective and then kind of take that comedic aspect out of it and really analyze the situation. I don't think that the radar, Goering underestimating radar, or the Germans as a whole, the German Oberkommando der Luftwaffe as a whole underestimating the effect of radar being the crucial point. It was a link in the chain, but it wasn't the crucial link. There were certain factors, like we said in the whole talk that we already had, that from the outstart prevented the Germans from really having, quote unquote, a chance, maybe.
Yeah, so next question is for me, Dax Waggington, I hope I got it right. What was the quality of British and German pilots during the Battle of Britain, training and experience? As mentioned before, the Germans were, most of them that were captured were basically all trained before the war. And I think via the Luftwaffe field video I have the exact numbers on training, but the Germans started with way better training.
Yeah,
I think they had 100 or 200 hours more than the British at that time. I actually have the paper here, and if I'm lucky, I find the numbers. But meanwhile, take you over, Bismarck.
Yeah, like I wanted to say, the German pilots on average had more operational experience, because you got to remember, Britain never really sent Spitfires over to France for the defense of the Battle of France. The first time the Luftwaffe really ran into Spitfires was at Dunkirk, and that was really at the end of the Battle of France. So there are Hurricane pilots that had some experience, but that overall took a beating in France, had some experience, but not compared to the Luftwaffe that I was already in Poland before that, and that fought the whole Battle of France. So when you then look at maybe flight hours, it's going to be a little bit more complicated because the RAF also put bomber pilots or retrained bomber pilots to become fighter pilots, as far as I know. So they might have a lot of hours already, but they don't have really operational experience when it comes to flying a fighter plane. So on the whole, I would say the Luftwaffe had the advantage there. Although it must also be said that flying the British planes, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, was probably a little bit easier on the pilot than the German 109. Especially the Spitfire was very easy to handle for even a novice pilot. And that spoke in the Brits' favor during the battle as well.
And I have a quote here from James Coram, Defeat of the Luftwaffe in 1935 to 1945 in the book Why Air Forces Fail. Really good book. The Luftwaffe began the war with well-trained pilots. In 1940 to 1941, German pilots went into operational units with approximately 250 hours of total flight time, about 100 hours of which were in the aircraft they would fly into combat. This compared favorably with the RAF, which sent pilots into action with about 200 hours of training and only 60 to 75 hours in operational aircraft. So you have in total you have 50 hours more on the Germans, according to this, and in total, and also for the plane they would fly at least 25 to 40 hours more, which also would add to that what you said with the bomber pilots.
Yeah.
So yes, back then the Germans had more and better training, and also they had probably more pilots with combat experience from Spain, Poland, France, Netherlands, or even Norway. Yeah. So at Bismarck, or both, have you guys seen the movie Soldier of Orange from 1997? I don't know that at all.
No.
So
I'm gonna check it out now, just so I see what it is. Maybe I've seen it.
Amateur did a video on the topic of the Battle of Britain, if I recall rightly. Yes, I did 3 videos, basically 2 and 1 with some trivia. And the one which is watched the least, the setting of the Battle of Britain, is, I think, the better one actually, because it gives you a better understanding of the strategic air defense and everything. Bismarck, how much difference would the Mark V armed Spitfires have made using 76 machine guns to bring down German bombers? Was very inefficient compared to some 20mm cannons. I really like this one.
Yeah. So the Mark V Spitfire, yes, it does have more firepower. I'm not completely convinced that it's actually so much of a better aircraft than the Mark I and Mark II. It had some advantages, of course, over the earlier Spitfires. Armament was, of course, one of them. And against the bombers, that would have been a huge thing. I think one of the other advantages was that actually that the Spitmark V has no longer a carburetor engine. So that's actually pretty good because, as the carburetor, it's not the crucial flaw that some people think it is, but it's having an injection engine is obviously better. So having the cannons during the Battle of Britain, I think, would have done a huge difference to when attacking the bombers, especially the Dornier 17s. Less so perhaps the Heinkel and the Junker 88s, but still 8 303s against 2 cannons. I would, for example, always take the 2 cannons, even though those Spitmark 5s also had some machine guns. But they didn't have them. And it actually is funny sometimes how the Brits claimed their 303s were doing insufferable damage to the German bomber force, when actually in fact they weren't. A lot of bombers came back with so many holes you could barely count them, but they were still flying. The Brits during the Battle of Britain initially very much over what's the word over I'm completely lost on the word now.
Start the sentence again.
I'm looking for the German word now. I'm losing the German word as well.
Try the
But
sentence.
they had too high of opinion of the free or freeze, let's say.
Yeah.
And I think during the Battle of Britain, they actually realized that relying on the free or freeze wasn't good enough. They needed 20mm cannons.
Overconfidence.
Overconfidence, yeah.
Because this is why I missed the beginning of the sentence, so this is why I asked for this. So I have now a question for me, which I pass on to Bismarck. I don't know if this was asked yet, but do you think that the Bf-109 was designed too much to certain specifications compared to its upgradability?
With the Bf-109, it's tough. It's a tough question because the way that aviation has or continued to develop during the World War was not to the Bf-109's strength. So we were seeing a shift from very early on in the war where a lot of planes or a lot of countries favor horizontal maneuverability, very much in the way of the interwar years or even the Great War, over vertical maneuverability or vertical performance. The Bf-109 in a certain way changed that. There are some other planes, of course, that did that relatively well as well. You see it, for example, with the Russians, who very early on also noticed that the air war could change. Now, they had some bureaucratic and political reasons for why their initial focus on these new kind of generation of planes didn't really work out. But you see the Bf-109 in the early war being very much the vanguard of a new kind of fight. And later on, that further then develops into these kind of heavy planes, very powerful planes like the P-47, the Focke-Wulf 190, who are very well suited to these kind of boom and zoom attacks. That's what we in simulation terms, in combat simulation terms, we always call boom and zoom, where other planes can't keep up. Now, the Bf-109 was designed to really break, or not really to completely break, but to go away from what had been established before. So it was supposed to be very fast. It was supposed to climb fast and just to have a good dive and all those things. So in that way, it was a front runner really in most nations, compared to most nations. When it comes to upgrading the actual airframe and going down further down the line, 1943, 1944, 1945, of course, the airframe that was conceptualized in the 30s is not going to hold up that much anymore. That is obvious. So I would say that the Bf-109 was very much a product of its time and a visionary product of its time, but that doesn't stop it from being outdated later on, especially in a war where technological advantage are going on at an accelerated pace. So the only fault that we can maybe say at this point is that the Bf-109 was maybe not suitably or quickly enough replaced by other planes that the Germans could have potentially produced in its stead, like the 190s. But at that point, you can still make the argument that the Germans kept the 109 competitive with brute force. I hope that answers the question.
Probably not only that question.
Yeah.
So I think we start to finish up the last questions. I think there's one at you and me. Did the Luftwaffe use captured planes like the Czechoslovakian Avia 543 under license or locally produced Tupolev SB2, etc. in the Battle of Britain? I don't know exactly, but I would say no, because basically the Luftwaffe had better planes and the pilots were training them, so they probably used them for training, if at all.
Yeah, that's what I would say as well. I don't know of any planes like that, the ones you mentioned, being used during the Battle of Britain. If, then it would surprise me, but it would make an interesting topic to look into. But yeah, the Luftwaffe had better planes, especially when they looked at the planes the Italians had. They were happy that they had, the material they actually had.
Okay.
So
next one, Samuel Thompson, Avery in Pete Townend's book on the Battle of Britain. He contends that the area was a few days away from collapse when Goering shifted the bombing from the south efforts to London. What is your opinion? Basically, the historic consensus is that this is complete bullshit. I think I addressed this in several quotes in my misconceptions about Second World War, my top
Yeah.
11, and it's from basically the Cambridge History of the Second World War, I think, is from 2015, and actually the headline for the Battle of Britain ends with a question mark. So they say Battle of Britain question mark. This is the thing, and they said it was basically never a fair fight at all. So the this is this. I think this is this the psychological thing of it was one cause or it was on the verge, it was so important, or someone made a dumb decision. It's this monocausalytic view that one thing changed everything. One of my professors put it this way. For instance, the battle in the medieval times, the knight went into battle, but he lost the horseshoe on his horse, so he couldn't charge. So the right flank never broke in, so they lost the battle, they lost the war, the king got killed, and now we have the Second World War or something. So this causality change where some small thing changes everything, to a certain degree they can happen, but no, this was not the thing at all. The RAF was not, the fighter command was not near breaking or something far away from it. So, no, wait, please stop the police discussion. So, at Bismarck, Lemons of the Battle of Britain, the Bolton, Paul Deviant, and the BF 110. What was the thinking behind them, and why did it turn out so badly?
Oh, okay. So
Oh
I'm
my
trying
god,
to
this is
keep this
gonna
short.
this take a while.
I'm gonna keep it very short and just go into the last part of your question. Sorry about that, but I don't want to take too much of everybody's time. Why did they turn out so badly? First of all, let me just state here on the record that I love the Defiant. I don't think it's a very good plane, but I actually love it because it's just such a goofy little aircraft. The Bolton Pole Defiant, it very much comes out of theory, and the BF-110 as well. There was a theory behind them, and the ones that designed it, or the ones that asked for it, thought that the theory would hold up in practice. This is not the case. Now, the Defiants had some success. They did shoot down some planes, and the BF-110 did shoot down some planes. The Defiant in the long run was probably the worst of the two in terms of design and practicality, whereas the BF-110 gets a very, very bad rep because of its performance during the Battle of Britain. The BF-110, and I should probably make a video about this, was actually not a good aircraft. It served up all the way until 1945, some of them at least, not all of them, of course. And it was a very versatile platform. You could do some good fighter bombing with it. It had a good amount of firepower, which was at its time pretty much the best firepower, or the heaviest firepower carrying plane of its time. And if it hit something, especially in a bomber hunting role, it was devastating. The problem is that during the Battle of Britain, the practicality of it was reduced. And while it did do some fighter bombing where it did well, it also was used as an escort where it did less well. But all the way throughout the war, you see BF-110s doing really, really well. Very versatile aircraft. The Germans did pretty much everything with them that they could. They did reconnaissance with them. They did bombing with them. They did fighter bombing with them. They did anti-shipping with them. They did fighting, of course, fighter-on-fighter combat with them. They did bomber hunting with them. They did night fighting with them. Exceptional aircraft in many of its ways. And the Battle of Britain performance is the reason why everybody thinks it's bad. It was not a bad plane. It had its limitations, absolutely, like any plane. But it was a good aircraft in pretty much every way.
Yeah, I would agree on that. And I think these are the final two questions. With Wildhide, if the US Lend-Lease Act would have started during the Battle of Britain, would have had a major effect? No, basically because everything would be delayed to a certain degree anyway. So the effects, and also I think at that time Britain still had money to pay the United States, so it wouldn't have made. I think the major difference was in the beginning that the that Britain wasn't running into problems and getting bankrupt. And the other thing is the United States had to crank up all the production and everything over the long run. So the Battle of Britain was far too short for that. And the next question from Marty Van Ryn, I hope I got it right. Do you like books about memoirs of regular soldiers compared to academic style books? I think you mean if I like memoirs of regular soldiers compared to academic books. The main problem with memoirs is that I think they are really good for giving an impression on what it had on people or how they dealt with it to a certain degree. If they weren't written with certain intentions, but the problem is everybody has an agenda or some bias, and the other thing is also the human memory is very faulty. Let's say that if you want to read more on this, read Daniel Schachter's books, The Seven Sins of Memory. After that, you will probably get a bit paranoid. And the other thing is, memoirs, I think, for facts are really bad and problematic because people remember stuff wrongly or they want to portray something in a certain way. And this is what I said, I think memoirs and also interviews are good for authenticity, but authenticity should never ever be mistaken for accuracy. And also, if you read memoirs or something, you should have a clear understanding of the stuff around it. They're good for giving an impression of the time back then or how the people thought about it, but if they're taken out of context or with the wrong knowledge, you can't know what's true or not. I read Panzer Leader from Guderian, and I took it way too much at face value. I was pretty young, it was before university, and since then I basically stay as far away from memoirs usually as possible, or I take them as this was their impression, this is what they thought, but let's look up what is the academic consensus or what other people write about this and what is especially written in the documents or something. Is it backed up by something? This is the thing. And with memoirs of soldiers and generals and commanders in general, we should never forget, if you look at we have quite a lot of petty arguments on the internet, yeah. Probably everyone has a few. And you see, there's nothing at stake at all. And now you take someone like Guderian, who commanded 10, 20, he had Panzer Corps, and at his point, Brosi was the inspector of the Panzer troops. So he basically had thousands of men that in a way died under his command. He has to justify in his own mind, not just to the outside world, just in his own worldview, what he has done or not done. The guilt and everything around this, not to mention the whole, just imagine, even without the whole, the Nazi war crimes and the Nazi crimes, the Holocaust, just leave that out. Just only under quotation marks, the dead soldiers, with how much stress and everything he has to deal. And then write such a thing. And this, you can't completely cut that out. I mean, I went to boot camp and I remember I was under quite a stress in boot camp. Then a friend of mine too, and we sat in my car and we said, well, I don't know how we deal with the next week. A few weeks later, we sat in the same car and I said to my friend, do you remember the conversation we had? And he answered, yes, I remember, but it doesn't feel right anymore. It feels, I know we said we can't deal it anymore, but actually it was no problem then. And I said, yeah, I feel the same, but I also remember what we said. And this was cognitive dissonance at its best, but we still knew what we said. And I learned in my life that a lot of people actually, at a certain point, start to claim, I never said that. Or this never happened, this event. This is something wrong, you are lying or something. So our memory basically adapts to the identity we have of our own, of ourselves. Our memory is not a hard drive, it serves a function of maintaining our identity to a certain degree. And this is something you should be always aware if you read memories or even if someone tells you something from the past.
Yeah, I mean, the memoirs are easy to get into because there's so many of them, and some of them have become classics. But the best thing really you can do is just read a couple of books on the general context of a given battle and so on, and then look at what some of these memoirs say about those battles. And they can expand your understanding on, for example, the tactical level quite significantly. But at the same time, you have to remember that they are the product of somebody's mind, essentially, a memory. And sometimes memories fool us. It's simply how things are.
Yeah. Well, I think 2 hours and 4 minutes.
Oh.
And I'm sweating like a pig. So I think this is good.
We've been chewing over a whole lot of things, and I think we've said many things double and so on. I'm sure we made some mistakes along the process.
Yeah, probably.
This is the nature of things. People will be certainly pointing those out. But yeah, it's been really good having all of you guys here as well.
So yeah, then thank you, Bismarck, and everyone for joining, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.